So there's an unbelievably hilarious poll out from YouGov. Now, what you got to keep in mind, it's a YouGov Economist poll. What you got to remember about YouGov is it has a very liberal slant, and it has a very specific liberal slant. So YouGov's polls are fundamentally flawed, and I'll never fully trust them again because during the primary, for some reason, the average of polls that Elizabeth Warren was getting, the poll numbers Elizabeth Warren was getting, somehow every single YouGov poll consistently had Elizabeth Warren's numbers like plus 10 or something ridiculously out of the average. So it's very bizarre the sort of slant it had. I don't even understand how they got there. Methodology must have been real biased. But here's what's hilarious, okay? It's a poll asking who was the best president in U.S. history. Number one is Barack Obama at 18%. Second is Abraham Lincoln at 17%. Trump is at 13%. Roosevelt is at 12%. Reagan is at 10%. Washington is at 9%. Kennedy is at 6%. Roosevelt is at 3%. Clinton is 2%. And Jefferson is 2%. So with the Roosevelts, I'm guessing the top Roosevelt is FDR. I'm actually not 100% sure that is FDR that they have above Teddy, but I feel like that's probably what it is. But anyway, so you have Obama at the top. So there's a couple of things to note about this list, right? The first thing you have to note is obviously recency bias, which is clearly exhibited here, right? Obama and Trump being top contenders on this list automatically indicate recency bias. But obviously, Obama is nowhere near number one in terms of best presidents in U.S. history. So when it comes to criterion for best president in U.S. history, I have a couple of criterions for that. One of them really, to me, is sort of fundamental change. You fundamentally changed the way things were. You did a really serious action that was so game-changing. It was a huge step. I'm talking massive, monumental step in the right direction. Also, presidents who, despite a lot of barriers or potential barriers, in things preventing them, roadblocks preventing them from enacting this monumental change, they found a way to fight through it and were able to succeed despite those kinds of roadblocks. Those are, to me, what really define the best presidents in U.S. history. People who, were taking positions that were very progressive, and we look at it now as that's common sense. Like, freeing black people from being slaves. Everyone's like, oh, well, that's obvious, of course, because, slavery is immoral, it's wrong, right? Back then, it wasn't as clear, right? But people like Abe Lincoln who really fought to free the slaves, yes, those are kinds of things that are really they're very monumental, obviously, and it was not an easy road, right? Those things were not easy to do. So when you're talking about people who should really be at the top of the list, I think of Abe is definitely up there, of course, because he obviously, fought through a lot of stuff to maintain the Union and free the slaves, of course. An interesting what if I have actually is, what would U.S. history have been like? What would Reconstruction have been like if Abe Lincoln was not assassinated, right? Because he got assassinated. It was, I believe, Andrew Johnson who ended up being, I think, the first president to be impeached. And there were only two that were actually impeached. He was one of them. But he did absolutely nothing for the Reconstruction era. It was unbelievably horrible. He actually forced the Republican Congress to pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment because he wasn't doing anything. But I wonder if the whole 40 acres and a mule thing would have gone through if Lincoln was there. Honestly, I don't know. But it's one of U.S. history's most interesting what-if scenarios, in my opinion, even though a lot of people don't talk about it. But, Abe Lincoln is definitely up there. FDR is definitely up there for me. I also put LBJ up there. When I think of, like, my top three presidents, it's probably the two Roosevelts and then LBJ. Now, the problem is, right, with the presidency, right, this is what a lot of people do. They point out one thing that was bad or maybe even really bad, right? And they go, oh, well, that negates them. There's no presidency in which everything was great. It's just impossible, okay? I can't think of a single one where you could figure that. there's just no way. Only person I can think of is like maybe Jimmy Carter, but the offhand of that is, he didn't really do enough great stuff. So, like LBJ, for example, he established Medicare and Medicaid through the Social Security Act. He did a lot of that stuff, right? He had his whole plan against poverty, the Great Society programs, what he had, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, that's LBJ. He had a lot of barriers to go through, especially with the Supreme Court, but he used the bully pulpit and he fought through and he passed the 1965 Civil Rights Act. He, established Medicare to me and Medicaid. To me, those are transformational things that he also had a lot of barriers to go through. And to me, that's what defines truly the best president. Now, you could point out the Vietnam War, for example, and that's a horrible, horrible thing that he did. It was a colossal failure. It was a horrendous move. But, how do you kind of balance these things? An interesting sort of consistency you'll see when analyzing previous presidents is their foreign policies. There's always something you could pick that was really bad. So with FDR, the Japanese internment camps, fucking horrible, right? Absolutely horrible. The firebombing of Tokyo, which did start under FDR, horrible, right? So there's always those things you could pick out, but so you kind of have to figure out a balance. Does the greatness sort of outweigh that? You're just never going to find a presidency where it's perfect. It's impossible. Teddy Roosevelt, he also had a lot of those issues in foreign policy and, South America and stuff. But Teddy Roosevelt, obviously a conservationist. He was given the moniker of being the trust buster, although I think Taft actually did more trust busting than he did. I think Teddy actually broke a strike by threatening to bring in the National Guard. But he did do some stuff to help strikers. So, he was kind of a little bit all over the map there. And then FDR, obviously, with all of his stuff, FDR really set a trend that I really liked. The trend that FDR set was one that was sort of a vision for America with heavy welfare states, heavy corporate regulation, really trying to make sure people have access to the basic needs of society. You also got to remember, man, FDR was up against the Lochner-era court, and he actually fought so hard, he did some borderline, if not straight up unethical things, like court packing. That court packing was... if it's not unethical straight up, it's definitely pushing the boundary. Dude almost basically created a kangaroo court. But that Lochner-era court was shutting down everything he was passing. All of his acts that he was passing that was meant to be relief and long-term relief in light of the Great Depression. The Lochner era said, right to contract, so, you could have child labor and things of that nature, the Gilded Age, all of that stuff. So, to me, the stuff that he set, and FDR really set a trend, and that trend kept going up until Ronald Reagan's presidency. And so, if you're a conservative, and you're thinking of the best president in U.S. history, Reagan and Jefferson are probably going to be atop your list, right? Jefferson was a big, small government type of guy, although his vision for America was just completely backwards. He thought it was going to be an agrarian society, total failure. That's not true of what it was going to turn out to be. But Reagan totally transformed everything, because with FDR, you started this sort of this New Deal era of presidents. Even, Republicans were sort of forced into the hand of being more in that direction. And so there were talks, Truman had talks about establishing a national healthcare system, all of this kind of stuff, right? It set off this wave and this vision, and he had to fight really hard to get it. Now, he had some negatives, obviously, like I mentioned earlier, but those kinds of things are absolutely transformational. Social Security, and then remember, the Social Security Act is what enabled LBJ to establish Medicare and Medicaid. So keep that in mind, right? So FDR, obviously. Reagan was absolutely transformational. He completely destroyed the United States, literally to this day. So he's president in like the 80s. It's now been like 40 years, and we are still in that dumb Reagan mindset of government is the problem. We need to cut taxes. All of that, deregulate, allow the stock market, all this stuff. He was the one who brought back stock buybacks, all of this crazy stuff, let alone, I mean, he actually started even robbing Social Security. He started taking, he was bleeding the coffers dry in his foreign policy with all the foreign policy he was doing. And he started taking money from the surplus of Social Security. The guy was doing horrible things in Latin America. He was absolutely horrible. But if you're a right-winger and you're looking at Reagan, he's probably atop your list. I mean, he's got to be, right? He transformed America into the sort of conservative mainstream shithole that it is now, the dumb mindset that government is a problem and, we need to cut taxes and all this stupid stuff. And that is what really sucks. But I'm hoping that the expiration is coming up when it comes to, that Reagan mentality. Hopefully, a lot of times in politics, you get a sort of equal reaction. So after that, 40, 50 years or whatever it was, it was like about 40 years pretty much of, the New Deal mantra and ideology. Now you got a 40 years of Reaganism, right? So hopefully we'll break out of the Reaganism and go back into that New Deal mentality. And if you're a conservative, you probably look at the Reagan, Reagan's, amnesty or his lack of action on abortion and his thoughts on, machine guns. Those are probably the negatives you look at, the way that I look at FDR's negatives of, firebombing of Tokyo and stuff like that. For obvious reasons, Lincoln is obviously, top of the list of, obviously up at the top for sure. Obviously, doesn't even need explanation. Obama does not deserve to be atop the list. He didn't do anything transformational. Everything that he did either was a silly attempt at a bandage of a system that was broken and he didn't fix it, or it was, expanding it. Remember the NSA spying, the breaking of civil liberties. He continued all of that stuff. He continued Bush's tax cuts. He didn't do anything transformational. Even Obamacare, man, like his sort of landmark legislation, that didn't really fundamentally change things at all. It really just sort of perpetuated the system that we have, the broken private insurance system that we have, instead of a real overhaul of the insurance system altogether. He was supposed to come in and change Wall Street. It just didn't happen. You know what I mean? He was great for Wall Street. And also, another sort of criteria you can use, although this is sort of something you already see, a lot of these presidents come in when there is national disaster. So Obama came in during the 2008 recession, and eventually the economy rebounded, but it was a really slow recovery, man. And that's because the stimulus he passed was pretty garbage. It was very weak. So even though it ended up rebounding like years later, he took too long really to insert enough money to basically, push spending to try to boost the economy back to normal. So that's another reason why I don't have him anywhere near atop the list, is because in response to disaster, he was too weak and too slow to respond. He wasn't a transformational person. He didn't even get a public option through. So, he just simply wasn't transformational. He had all these roadblocks. He didn't get through any of the roadblocks. If that was LBJ or if it was FDR, I can guarantee you they'll find a way to get through the roadblocks. I promise you that. But Obama, he just wasn't that guy. Obama, at the end of the day, he was a genius campaigner. He was really good at giving speeches and getting votes. But when it came to actually being president, he just wasn't that good at it. He just wasn't able to be that transformational guy. He really had the opportunity to be FDR too, especially coming in off that, 2008 recession. But he was too weak. He just didn't have it. I feel like with this kind of thing, it takes this sort of badassness, or it takes this sort of will and desire. I just don't think he had it in him. I really don't. I don't think he had it in him. I don't even know if he really believed in a lot of the progressive stuff like Medicare for all or ending the wars and things of that nature. But again, putting Obama, putting like FDR or Teddy or one of these guys into that seat, I guarantee you they're gonna find a way to break through those roadblocks, because that's the kind of guys they were. And that's what makes them at the top of the list, is because even when they had these kinds of barriers to making transformational change, they found a way to break through it. So Obama's obviously not atop the list. Trump being the best president in U.S. the third best president in U.S. history is laughable. But again, there's two factors leading to him being at number 3. One of those factors is recency bias, which I already discussed earlier. The other is that there's this cult-like fan base of Trump, obviously, where there's obviously going to be 13% of people who are going to say that because there's this Trump cult, essentially. But, that's kind of what I think. George Washington, I guess you could put up towards the top. JFK also. You do got to put up JFK up there, too. I will say JFK is actually underrated. My thoughts about JFK have definitely become better towards him. After doing more research on him, JFK is actually pretty deserving of being up towards the top. Bill Clinton was a terrible president. Really horrible. He really contributed to the right-wingification of Democrats and the Democratic Party with his triangulation and his sneaky conservatism. So, fuck Bill Clinton. I hate Bill Clinton with all every fiber of my being. Conservatives, I'm sure, love Thomas Jefferson because he was more of a libertarian type of guy. So if that's your vision for America, he's going to be towards the top. But there's just certain presidents that really can't be at the top of the list, honestly. But that's the list here that I think is really funny. Let me know who your top presidents are. For me, some combo, obviously, of both the Roosevelts, LBJ, and, I'd probably throw JFK in there, too. And then, obviously, there's Abe Lincoln and, Washington, those guys, obviously, for obvious reasons, why they're up at the top. But interesting poll, kind of weird result.